From the world of politics to the world of business, this is Balance of Power. Live from Washington, D.C.
From Bloomberg's Washington, D.C. studios to our TV and radio audiences worldwide, welcome to Balance of Power. I'm Joe Matthew. Donald Trump's pick to run the Defense Department makes the rounds today on Capitol Hill. Pete Hegseth meeting with the senators who will decide his fate as lawmakers return for the lame duck session. We'll have the latest with Aaron Covey of the Cook Political Report. Russia launches airstrikes in support of the Syrian army after rebel fighters take control of Aleppo. We'll discuss possible outcomes with Natasha Hall at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. And the hemisphere's busiest container port braces for the impact of tariffs under the Trump administration after recording its busiest quarter ever. We're joined by the Port of LA's Executive Director, Gene Soroka, later this hour. Thank you so much for joining us on the Tuesday edition of Balance of Power here on Bloomberg TV and radio. President-elect Trump's choice for Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth continuing his meetings today with Senate Republicans, a second day of rounds on Capitol Hill. South Carolina Senator Lindsey Graham was asked about Hegseth's path to confirmation this afternoon.
I think, some of these articles are very disturbing. He, obviously has a chance to defend himself here, but, some of this stuff is going to be difficult. Time will tell. Some of the things have to be addressed, and, we'll see.
Joining us now, Bloomberg's Michael Shepard, who's had his eyes on this transition. Mike, it's great to see you here. Pete Hegseth could become the next Matt Gaetz, is the feeling this morning or throughout the day today in Washington. Before he started making the rounds, there are questions about his stand on women in combat, his previous statements about women in the military, as well as a series of sexual assault allegations that have surrounded him. Will he get to a confirmation hearing?
Well, it's a good question. And on those allegations of sexual misconduct, he's denied them all.
Yes.
But nonetheless, as they pile up, it raises questions in senators' minds, in the minds of the lawmakers who are going to have to vote on whether to confirm him for one of the most critical posts in Donald Trump's incoming administration, running the Defense Department. It's running the military, but all the colossal bureaucracy and big contracts that go with it. It's a big job. And adding to that is his background. He really does not have the track record of, for example, he's never run an agency of any scale whatsoever, let alone something the size of the Pentagon.
Sure.
So there are already a lot of questions in senators' minds going into this. And as these allegations, again, that he's denied, continue to pile up, you see lawmakers who are very loyal to Donald Trump, like Lindsey Graham, start to signal their discomfort with this election.
Yeah, it's really something. A combat veteran, of course, a former commentator on Fox News, but not necessarily a manager, which I think is what you're talking about here. But there was an important update today when it comes to the vetting of these candidates, Mike, and whether the FBI should in fact be conducting background checks. The Trump transition team has an allergy to the FBI and has been conducting its own background checks. And there was a thought that there could be a new normal here. There is a new agreement, it seems, with Republican leaders in the Senate to do it the old-fashioned way.
Yes, and they want to do it the old-fashioned way for a couple of reasons. One, Republican senators have been demanding this and really putting pressure on the incoming administration to follow regular order, which is to allow the FBI to do the job it's been doing really since the Kennedy administration, and that is vetting nominees for key positions in government that the president chooses. And the president's free to choose whomever they want, but with advice and consent from the Senate, they get confirmed. But you can't confirm somebody unless you know enough about them, including perhaps troubling aspects of their background that the FBI might, with its investigative capacities, be able to turn up. And we're seeing some of those questions, of course, surrounding Pete Hegseth and the ones that surrounded Matt Gaetz before he withdrew as Trump's pick for Attorney General. So that's one aspect. The other is that other incoming selections for key positions will need access to classified information even before they get on the job. And if you're able to do a background check on someone quickly enough, they can actually start working with the current administration so that there's a clean handoff on January 20th.
Hence the term transition. Mike Shepard, thank you so much. Tomorrow, Scott Bessent will be making his rounds in the Senate. We'll, of course, keep tabs on that for you. In a move that surprised many, meantime, South Korea's president declaring martial law late last night. Many of us woke up to the headline this morning, the move prompting street protests before President Yoon reversed course and lifted the order. That happened just a few hours ago, following a vote in the legislature to do just that. State Department Principal Deputy Spokesman Vedant Patel addressing reporters before the About Face.
We are watching the recent developments in the ROK with grave concern. We are seeking to engage with our Republic of Korea counterparts at every level, both here in the United States and in Seoul. The Secretary has been briefed, and we're keeping him appraised of the developments, as well as monitoring closely what's happening on the ground.
With reaction now to South Korea's declaration of martial law and where we may go next here, we bring in Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisko. Michelle, it's good to see you, and thank you for joining us here at the table. This happened quickly. While many people were sleeping, the entire thing went underway in South Korea. Is the damage done nonetheless?
Yeah, in a word, I think, yes, there's a lot of damage that has been done. And it tells you everything you need to know when you see the lifting of the martial law decree happen in the wee hours of the South Korea morning. So it says something about what President Yoon was finally getting the message from all corners of markets, foreign, domestic allies, and critics alike. No one seems to have thought this was a good idea, and it already has done quite a bit of damage. If you saw the markets today, South Korean won slipped more than it has at any point since the global financial crisis. It's going to take some time to make up that ground, even though he reversed this decision.
Sure.
Domestically, you saw, the Confederation of Trade Unions in Korea planning a strike because they said, one of their top officials said it was a crazy thing that this came out. Domestic partners in his own party, there was a unanimous vote of 190 of the 300 lawmakers saying and demanding this to be overturned. So he's going to have to kind of repair that damage domestically. But at the same time, on the foreign policy front, the U.S., among many allies and partners, is questioning where this came from and what it means to damage the image of South Korea as such a bedrock of democracy.
Yeah, sure.
And it's hauntingly familiar to the debate that we're having in the U.S. right now about executive overreach. So it's going to be an interesting way forward to see how President Yoon, if he is able to stay in power, how he's able to repair those relationships.
He used the word coup today. How does the U.S. look at this?
I think the U.S., you saw from the State Department response, it was, I think it was probably a little bit of a shock to officials as well.
That's the company line. What are they saying behind closed doors?
Well, we haven't heard too much yet. I think they were digesting, the blow-by-blow as it came. And, of course, with President Biden out in Angola right now, it's not an ideal time to get, an official response full-throated from NSC or President Biden himself. But I think it's not helpful. It's certainly not helpful to the relationship that the U.S. has tried to foster, including over the past 4 years of the Biden administration, with South Korea as a critical ally in the region, as a counter to China, as a partner with Japan, and trying to repair that trilateral relationship as well, Japan, South Korea, and the U.S.
Right. President Biden on his way home from Angola tonight. Bloomberg's Michelle Jamrisko, thank you so much. Coming up on Balance of Power, a deep dive into the process and the hurdles for Donald Trump's cabinet picks with Erin Covey, editor at the Cook Political Report. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. We thank you for joining us. On December 20th, not long from now, just 17 days, government funding is set to expire. Unless, of course, Congress can pass something, a continuing resolution or something more long-term. Not many people right now, to be fair, are talking about a government shutdown. We don't have the countdown clocks out yet, but there is still no deal as the deadline looms. Lawmakers just back to town now, and joining us is Erin Covey, editor at the Cook Political Report, with her view on a very busy lame duck session. And we'll get to the confirmations as part of the transition. Erin, it's good to see you. There seems to be a thought now that we need to do a kick the can to then kick the can, that there will be no deal by December 20. Lawmakers craft something to get us through the new year, and they start again in January. Is that how you see it?
Yeah, it seems more and more likely that we're not going to get full government funding deal passed by December 20th, and more likely there will be a stopgap bill that would fund the government into mid-March, at which point Republicans would have about a month to put together a full spending bill. But it seems like, from what we're hearing from Speaker Mike Johnson, that is more likely. There is really no appetite for a government shutdown, of course. And so even though there haven't been any top lines released for a CR or a continuing resolution, there's no appetite from Democrats to shut down the government over this issue. So that seems to be the direction that we're headed.
So is March the target here? Because obviously this lame duck session is one thing. The new Congress will be something very different. You're an expert on the House. You cover elections. There's one race to be called still in California. And if all the confirmations go through the way Donald Trump wants them to, pulling a couple of Republicans out of the House, Mike Johnson could actually have a majority of one seat. Depends how things work out, but it's going to be razor thin. Would it not behoove him to get as much done now before they leave for the rest of the year?
Well, I think there's incentives on his right for folks to have this fight in the new year when Republicans have a trifecta and conservative hardliners think they can have more sway in that case. And because of the fact that Republicans are going into the new session with such an exceedingly narrow majority, these conservative hardliners have a little bit more sway over that outcome. And so I think that that's the incentive on that side. But yes, like you said, it is going to be very difficult on the outset to get anything done just because of the narrow majority. I think the fact that there is a Republican trifecta will provide a lot of incentives for the Republican majority in the House to work together to pass Trump's agenda. Obviously, there's a lot of other things that they would like to get done in the new year within the first 100 days. And so having a prolonged fight over government funding distracts from that.
Yeah, right. I want to ask you about the confirmation process that's underway right now. Pete Hegseth was making the rounds on the Senate side today. Scott Bessent will have his turn tomorrow. And these are two very different figures. After we saw the withdrawal of Matt Gaetz having been tapped for Attorney General, there are questions about what's going to happen to Pete Hegseth, largely because of some of the scandals that have surrounded him. While he maintains his innocence, several sexual assault charges against him, as well as his comments about women serving in the military. Aaron, is he going to get to an actual hearing? Never mind pass a vote. Will he get into that hearing room?
You know, I don't know. It seems like he is probably least likely among all of Trump's picks to pass that test. You know, it's not just the more moderate members of the Republican conference who are expressing more skepticism over him. It's also senators like Joni Ernst, who is a veteran herself and could also be a potential pick to lead the Pentagon if the Hegseth nomination falls through. But yeah, it seems clear based on comments from Republican senators over the past couple of days that he would face quite a battle potentially in these confirmation hearings if that goes forward.
You wonder if it gives cover to some of the others, which is what people were saying when Matt Gaetz was in the throes of things here. But Aaron, what is this majority going to look like in the new Congress? It's only about, 30 days away. We're going to be swearing in the next session here. And Mike Johnson could count on one hand how many Republicans will make the majority.
Right. So there is one House race that is still yet to be called. But if the Democrat Adam Gray's lead holds, then Republicans would end up with a 220-seat majority and Democrats would have 215 seats. However, that would effectively be more like 217 or 218 seats in the new year, just because we're expecting at least three vacancies in the House in the new year, depending on when people resign. Matt Gaetz is resigning. Mike Walls is resigning to lead the DNI. And then Elise Stefanik has also been picked to lead the UN. Now she would have a confirmation process to get through as well, so she may not resign immediately. But effectively, Republicans are probably going to have a one-seat majority, and that means they can't afford to have any defections.
And so has been said this week on Capitol Hill, that's one heart attack away from not being in the majority.
That's correct.
Things happen, Aaron. We saw that happen in the last session, right? I'll never forget Al Green being rolled into the chamber in a wheelchair straight from the hospital to make a vote that caught a lot of people by surprise. This is the type of session we could have with a majority of one. Will he need Democrats to keep the gavel?
Probably less likely. I do think that within the Freedom Caucus, obviously with Gaetz out, the ringleader who orchestrated the previous speaker's ouster, McCarthy's ouster last time around,
right,
no longer has power there. And I don't think there is an appetite within the Freedom Caucus to actually keep Johnson from getting the speaker's gavel. But obviously with such a narrow majority, we can't rule anything out.
It's great to have you back, Erin. Good to see you. Erin Covey is editor at the Cook Political Report on Balance of Power. Coming up, insurgent forces are moving closer to Syria's fourth largest city today. This goes on and quickly. We're going to take a look at rising tensions with Natasha Hall, her eyes on the Middle East. She's senior fellow at the CSIS Middle East program. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
Product in America. For those who don't make their product in America, they'll be forced to pay stiff tariffs for the privilege of competing with our cherished companies, stealing our jobs, our treasure, our wealth.
President-elect Donald Trump talking trade at a rally in Southern California before the election last month. No American port will be impacted more by his trade policies, imagine that, than the port of Los Angeles, the busiest container port in the Western Hemisphere. Talk about news you can use. We're joined by Gene Soroka, who's going to be directly impacted by whatever policies follow, the executive director of the aforementioned Port of Los Angeles. Gene, it's great to see you again. Welcome back to Washington.
Thank you, Joe.
You've got a great story to tell right now. I'm looking at numbers from the port from last month, just under 955,000, as you call it, 20-foot equivalent units. Those are containers, right?
Correct.
Normal language. Okay. Up 27% from the previous year. And that follows a record-setting quarter in the prior quarter here. I wonder, when will you know the impact of these tariffs being implemented when the next administration begins?
Well, we'll see, Joe. But as we've learned, there's a long way from the campaign trail to public policy and legislation. Yeah. So we're here in Washington getting ready for that transition. We're going to be talking to as many people as possible. And for every 4 containers that come through our port, it creates one job. So it's a big deal economically. And what we saw the last time with tariffs were that it created a little bit of a choppy supply chain, some rush to get cargo in before tariff milestone dates hit, and then a little bit of a drop-off afterwards. But I think we're prepared. Now we need to see what that policy really is going to be.
I wanted to ask you about front-running in that case. Are you hearing about any changes that are being made in anticipation of Donald Trump taking office?
Yes, and we've spoken to a lot of the importers, retailers, manufacturers, those that bring in the intermediary parts, and they are bringing in a little more cargo than they normally would in anticipation to build up inventories should prices go up through tariffs.
That doesn't bring lines the way it may have before COVID or during COVID, does it? You're talking about these record numbers here without having ships lined up off the coast to the horizon.
That's right.
What changed?
Yeah, we moved cargo from July 1 through October 31, more than we did in the surge year of 2021 or the second best year of 22, without one single ship backed up. And it was all hands on deck, from the Western railroads to the terminal operators, shipping lines, and the import-export community, all working together. Digitalization also helped so we could see cargo before it was coming in and better plan our skilled workforce and land. We took a lot of learning from that COVID period.
You sure did. If you're with us on Bloomberg TV or on YouTube, some great visuals right now as the work gets underway in the port of L.A. You talked about jobs. What conversations are you having with the transition team when it comes to that? Because we like to talk about tariffs in a vacuum. Donald Trump says it's his favorite word in the dictionary. We talk about it as a one-off here, as an economic point of conversation. You come at this from a very different angle, and that's people who have jobs, who get paid. What are they telling you about that?
Well, what we've also seen, Joe, is that according to some of the president-elect spokespeople that have been on television and through other media, this is the start of a conversation by using the topic of tariffs to try to negotiate. So we're going to take them at their word. But realistically speaking, 1 in 9 jobs in Southern California. 1 million families count on the work that we do at the port. It's 1 in 52 jobs nationwide.
Yeah.
Should the American consumer, who counts 70% of the U.S. economy, slow down in their buying, that'll have a direct hit on us and the workforce that goes out there every day.
Well, I remember the conversations we had about finding workers to drive trucks, to move cargo after it gets on shore. So this is very fresh in your mind, I know. And so is the holiday shopping season. Was that record quarter we just talked about, all the gifts that are going to be on people's front steps in a couple of weeks?
Yes, it really was.
Okay.
Underlying U.S. economy still very strong. We're buying. Black Friday early numbers just shy of $11 billion in sales. I'm eagerly awaiting Cyber Monday's numbers. But all indications are pretty good, and our retailers across the country have good inventory levels.
Yeah.
But also, please remember, we had drought conditions in the Panama Canal. The ongoing Houthi rebels and the security issues in the Red Sea aiding cargo coming to the West Coast, plus a yet-to-be-resolved dock workers negotiation on the East and Gulf Coast that still has a percentage of cargo coming our way.
That's why I love talking to you. Not only do you have to know how to run a port, which is a pretty big job, and I can't imagine doing it, but you have to be a geopolitical analyst and you need to be an economist, right? Think of all the things we just talked about. You're spinning a lot of plates in L.A.
Yeah, that's right. And keeping our mind tuned to all these conversations and all the data that's out there really does help us. And that's why just this afternoon we were over at the Agriculture Department talking with some of the growers and ranchers about what we could do to build even more U.S. exports through the Port of Los Angeles.
Yeah.
This is omnipresent every day.
I've only got 1 minute left. What are they suggesting for ideas?
Well, let's find out where we have a surplus of containers off of these big import numbers.
Yeah.
And let's see if our ag customers can use some of those instead of repositioning them empty back to Los Angeles.
You're still dealing with that. These empty containers going back to Asia. How do you then manage that in just our remaining time here, in our remaining moment, as I mentioned, in a world where resources are so important and supply chains?
A targeted approach. For every 5 imports, we have 1 export. The balance 4 go back empty. Let's try to use those with the export community in manufacturing, agriculture, recyclables. That was the key to today's conversation.
Fascinating. It's great to talk to you. Thanks for the insights. And we'd love to check in the new year, see how things are going with this transition, because they need the Port of L.A. to work no matter who's in the White House, right?
Will do, Joe.
That's
Thank
for
you.
sure. Gene, thank you so much. Gene Soroka is Executive Director of the Port of Los Angeles. Great to have you with us here on Balance of Power. Coming up, we're going to get back to the story that we mentioned, what's happening in Syria after the fall of Aleppo, rebel fighters continuing southward as Bashar al-Assad hunkers down in Moscow. Russian airstrikes, the latest development here in support of the Syrian army, and we'll have much more with Natasha Hall from CSIS's Middle East program on Balance of Power. This is Bloomberg TV and Radio. This is Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and Radio. Thanks for joining us. I'm Joe Matthew in Washington. As we turn our attention abroad, where a dormant war has reignited in Syria after rebel fighters took hold of Aleppo over the weekend, now seeking to build on their recent gains and capture more territory, raising the question of whether President Bashar al-Assad can hold on to power. He has made his way to Moscow, and joining us now for a closer look at all of this, Natasha Hall, Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies Middle East program. Natasha, it's great to see you. Welcome back to Bloomberg. As Bashar al-Assad hunkers down in Moscow, Russia has launched airstrikes in Syria in support of the Syrian army. Will Vladimir Putin bail him out this time?
Well, thank you for having me again, Joe. For sure, he will come to the rescue, even reluctantly as he is. And that's what we've seen in Idlib province over the past couple of days, where we've seen massive bombardment of these opposition-controlled areas. I mean, Russia is tied to Syria in many different ways, amongst them a very important air base and naval base in Syria. But it's also the crown jewel of Russia's sort of reemergence into the world beyond its near abroad. It's a launching pad for its interventions in Africa. So without a doubt, it will eventually come to the rescue.
Syrian government forces said to be regrouping for a counterattack. What will we see in the days ahead?
Well, what we've seen is the Assad regime and its allies essentially scrambling. Iran, one of its stalwart allies throughout the war, and Hezbollah have been significantly weakened by Israeli attacks in recent months. So it's quite difficult for Hezbollah to come to the aid of the Assad regime, given Israeli attacks continue on Hezbollah arms shipments. And Iran is also somewhat reeling, and so just grasping at various militia groups that they support in Iraq. So they are coming to the aid, but it remains to be seen how effective they will be compared to forces that we've seen in earlier years during this war.
Yeah, it's pretty remarkable to think, of course, there are some Americans in Syria, and we know what it's like to share airspace over Syria with the Russian military. Is that in the future for American pilots, American military pilots?
To share the space, I mean, there's been deconfliction between Russian and U.S. pilots for many years now, actually, and a real avoidance to have any kind of confrontation between Russia and the United States in Syria. Russia came to the aid of Assad, and really the U.S. administration has been sort of unwilling to do very much in Syria as a result. It really wants to avoid any kind of confrontation with a nuclear power in the Middle East. I mean, they have been doing that for years now, so I suspect there won't be any kind of confrontation, especially in a lame duck presidency.
An important point to make here. Natasha, I'd like to ask you about what's going on in Israel, because the White House was very eager to announce a breakthrough on a ceasefire between Israel and Hezbollah last week. Since then, Israel's military has begun striking what it calls terror targets in Lebanon. That was the case last evening, the IDF striking sites across Lebanon as the day went on. Can we still call this a ceasefire? And if not, what is it?
It's quite hard to call it that, isn't it, Joe? I mean, we've seen just bombardment ongoing, and that's primarily because there was a lot of loopholes in this ceasefire agreement that really leaned towards Israeli interests. Essentially, they were able to say if they see any ceasefire violations as they see them, that they will be able to strike once again. And so we've seen sort of the consequences of that in the past few days.
This is the word from the State Department. Vedant Patel, deputy spokesperson for state, had this response when asked earlier today if the ceasefire was holding.
Our hope and our expectation is that parties are going to abide by their commitments and that the ceasefire will continue to be implemented. We are continuing to support that implementation. We're working on continuing to build a robust mechanism that assists the parties in addressing violations.
But Natasha, Joe Biden suggested last week that this ceasefire with Hezbollah could help to unlock at last a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas. Does that seem realistic today?
I mean, it doesn't seem that realistic because we haven't really seen any pressure on Israel with the violations of this ceasefire or really anything else, including humanitarian access. The White House has urged Israel and the Israeli government to maintain, humanitarian access, to mitigate civilian harm. Now in Lebanon to prevent ceasefire violations, and we've seen that violated over and over again. But there isn't much pressure from the White House to change things. I think by delinking the Lebanon issue in Gaza, it makes it incredibly difficult to come to some kind of real ceasefire agreement in Gaza as well, because once again, there's just seemingly no pressure on Israel to do any of this. They are looking at a Trump White House in a few months. The President Trump, or soon-to-be President Trump, has already tweeted that it's payback time. Yeah. So it seems like the cards are in Israel's favor if it wishes to continue this campaign in Gaza.
Yeah, hell to pay in all caps on Truth Social yesterday, presumably aimed at Hamas. Natasha, President-elect Trump, he is calling for the hostages to be released by the time he's inaugurated on January 20, obviously with visions of Ronald Reagan going back a long time ago. Is that something that could actually happen between now and the inaugural?
I mean, it's possible. If Trump can say that he's responsible for some kind of deal, I'm sure he'll take that. I think Netanyahu would also want to give him a win, potentially, and throw shade, essentially, at President Biden and the Democrats as well.
Wow.
So we could potentially see some kind of deal. Now, whether that leads to, lasting peace or the end of suffering in Gaza, that's another thing.
Is there anything that Iran could do? And the two stories we're talking about here both involve Iran, whether we're talking about Syria or Lebanon or Israel, for that matter, in this case. What would Iran do to interfere with that deal?
I think Iran, for the long term, is going to try to regroup and recuperate its losses, to be frank, and hunker down. I don't think that they're sort of on their back foot, and it would be quite difficult to mount any kind of attack at this point. But your point speaks to a larger issue, which is that all of these wars are interconnected. Frozen conflicts do not remain frozen if the drivers of conflict remain. So whenever you have that, you have actors like Iran and others that will capitalize on opportunities, and you'll see this ongoing cycle of violence.
Yeah, it's great to have you back, Natasha. Natasha Hall, Senior Fellow at the Center for Strategic and International Studies Middle East Program. Thank you, as always. Coming up, Donald Trump's cabinet picks Scott Bessent, Pete Hegseth head to the Hill this week to win over senators before the start of the official confirmation process. Our political panel weighs in on these meetings and what they will lead to in January. It's next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
How do you feel about the women in combat?
Amazing women who serve in our military. It's an amazing women.
Do you
who
think
serve
they
in
should
our
be
military.
in combat?
I think they're already in combat.
I think they're already in combat, says Donald Trump's pick for Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth earlier today, making the rounds on Capitol Hill and responding to a reporter's question about whether women should be serving in combat roles in the military. He has previously said they should not. Joining us now is tonight's political panel, Ashley Davis, founding partner of West Front Strategies and Republican strategist, alongside Democratic strategist Kevin Walling, vice president at HG Creative. Great to see you both. Welcome. Ashley, we talked a little bit earlier on the early edition of Balance of Power about this process. He's survived another day of rounds on Capitol Hill. Some of these meetings, it's interesting to hear from senators speak so carefully about this. The question I guess I have with his statement on women in combat, with some of the sexual assault allegations that have been levied against him, which he denies, will he actually get to a confirmation hearing?
So I don't know exactly where Senator McConnell, Senator Collins, and Senator Lisa Murkowski are. Obviously, those are the three that everyone's watching.
That could sink the ship.
That could sink the ship. And who he's been meeting with so far are more of the people that are more supportive of Trump, or in that, like Senator Tuberville yesterday.
Sure.
I mean,
Ted Cruz last night.
Ted Cruz. So I think those three are the ones you have to watch. You also have to watch Joni Ernst, who's a fabulous member of Congress, who's on, going to be very important. These issues are very important to her. She obviously served in the military herself. And so she said publicly that she's looking forward to his background check. By the way, did you see that the transition did sign the agreement? Yep. So our earlier conversation, that does look like it's going in the right direction. But I do think that someone like Joni Ernst, even though she's obviously conservative, but these issues are important to her. So where does she fall? And so he's meeting with her this week. We'll see what her response is out of that. But I think she'll still say, I want to see what happens with the FBI background, right?
And we are apparently going to get them, to your point, Ashley, a memorandum of understanding. Trump team wanted to do this, or started doing it at least, with a private security firm, knowing that MAGA has a major allergy to the FBI, to the point where he wants to appoint someone to dismantle the agency. What does this agreement tell you?
Well, certainly that Susie Wiles, I think, is playing to the better angels of the Republican caucus. To Ashley's point, you saw, Susan Collins specifically say, I don't want to just see a background check. I want to see an FBI background check with Pete Hegseth. with other of these key nominees. I think Ashley's spot on in terms of naming Joni Ernst as one of the key people as part of this nomination process. She also obviously serves on the Armed Services Committee, is a combat veteran. Interestingly enough, you also saw Lindsey Graham maybe telegraphing to his friend at Mar-a-Lago that this is going to be a, quote, difficult process with Pete Hegseth. You saw similar elements play out with the Matt Gaetz nomination, with these senators kind of telegraphing through these interviews, and also in conversations with the president-elect.
Well, I'll tell you, you mentioned Tommy Tuberville, the senator from Alabama, meeting with Pete Hegseth as he made the rounds here, and had some interesting things to say about the pick following their meeting. Let's listen.
He's going to be a great Secretary of Defense. He understands it. As I tell him, we don't need a general officer, admiral, or a person of high command. We need a drill sergeant in the military. We need somebody to straighten the military out, to get the woke, the DEI affiliation out, and go from there.
Referring to the woke and the DEI that helped to inspire his blockade of military promotions at one point. Ashley, as someone who helped to create what is now the Homeland Security Department, what do you think of that? We don't need a general, an officer, an admiral, or a person of high command. We need a drill sergeant. Don't they need a manager?
Yes, and I think it's going to be very important to see who the number 2 is. Obviously, there's lots of talk. You put someone in that's someone that's from the private equity world, someone that runs business, to kind of, listen, no one disagrees with us, Republicans or Democrats. We overspend and have misspending happening in the Department of Defense and have for years. So there's obviously an issue. What I think Senator Tuberville was saying is we need someone that can, like, not do status quo. Nothing to do really with the wars that are happening, but more like the building and kind of how it's managed. One thing that he said on that interview that I think is interesting that people have been criticizing is that fact that he said he wants younger people. He thinks it's good that it's younger. And there's been criticism about him being 44 years old. And I went back and looked at this. Don Rumsfeld was 45 when he became Secretary of Defense the first time. And so, like, we probably do need to take the age thing out of the... I don't think that's something you use against him. I think there's other things that people are using against him, but that's not one of them.
Well, Pete Hegseth is walking the halls in the Senate today. Scott Bessent will be tomorrow. I'd love to ask you both about Donald Trump's pick for Treasury here, making his pitch to senators on Capitol Hill. We actually spoke with him in October, ahead of this election, about a couple of matters, including his idea here for a shadow Fed chair. Here's what he said.
I actually think it provides more certainty because you could do one of two things. The current Fed chair could be reappointed, so you created a path there, and the new Fed chair nominee would give forward guidance beyond the current Fed chair's sell-by date. So you would have forward guidance up until May 26 with Jay Powell, and then you would know the market could structure a forward curve since then.
So, Kevin, you imagine the conversations that these nominees, if I can call them that, are having with senators. This is somebody with some real sort of outside-the-box ideas on something like that. I can't imagine Jay Powell likes this idea of being cut off at the knees by a shadow chair. How will these different ideas play in his conversations with senators? Are they open-minded?
I think we'll see a shadow pope before we see a shadow chair, just in terms of the Fed.
Well, they're going to talk about tariffs. They're going to talk about tax cuts. They're going to talk about deficits.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think, you're seeing some early indications. John Thune is floating some pretty aggressive legislation when it comes to tax policy, when it comes to the border, that he wants to accomplish in the first 30 days using reconciliation. Scott Bessent will be a key figure in that effort in those first 30 days as he goes to the Hill tomorrow. I'm certain that he's going to face a lot of those questions in some of these one-on-one meetings.
This is a smooth ride for him, though, compared to the others, right? Pete Hegseth making this look pretty easy for Scott Bessent.
Yes, and he said that as a private citizen, and obviously his world has all changed, and he serves at the pleasure of the president, so it's really going to be the president's views. But even what he spoke of earlier, you did see Senators Langford, Grassley, Tillis, who actually think he's a great choice that they want to make sure what his views are about that, because they don't maybe necessarily agree with the shadow. But it's going to be interesting, exactly what you said, with what Thune came out with today with the first 30 days with reconciliation on the border, energy, and defense. I mean, Treasury will be involved, but not as much as it will be in the second reconciliation package, which will be tax reform. But he's fine.
You have it. We just solved
We're in
a lot at
agreement
this
too.
table right now.
He is totally fine, and he will get some Democratic support, I'm sure.
Yes, there will be no shadow pope. We also established that.
No shadow pope. God bless.
Political fallout continues following President Biden's pardon of his son Hunter. There is a second-day part of this story, and we'll get into it with our political panel next on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.
I think what President Biden did is absolutely abusive of the rule of law. Number one, he said for how long now that he would not pardon his son. The reasons he gave earlier for saying he wouldn't were persuasive. The reasons he gave now for changing his view midstream are totally unpersuasive.
Republican Senator Josh Hawley of Missouri earlier today reacting to President Biden's decision to pardon his son Hunter. Comment comes after President Biden dodged questions repeatedly about the action while meeting with the president of Angola in Africa today. Joe Biden on his way back to Washington tonight. And with us right now, our political panel, Ashley Davis and Kevin Walling. Kevin, I know that you're close with the president and the Biden family. This is something that came out of a difficult, apparently, family conversation over Thanksgiving on Nantucket. But there are a lot of questions today about whether Joe Biden always knew he was going to do this, and whether he was honest with the American public when he pledged to not.
Yeah, I think part of it is looking at the cast of characters that Donald Trump is assembling, especially at the Department of Justice, at the FBI, Kash Patel, Pam Bondi, who have spoken at length about the prosecution of Hunter Biden and the real fear that he would be prosecuted after the fact. Obviously, there was a sentencing date coming up in the next couple of days, and the president took this action well within his purview to do that as his only remaining son, to keep him out of jail.
We've heard critics from both sides on this, Ashley. I don't know what your thoughts are initially as a parent or as a political strategist, and those could be two different answers, I realize here. But it's interesting the way Joe Biden has framed this, something being personal, clearly. Some of his critics have suggested that this would not even be a story if he had also pardoned Donald Trump while he was at it. What do you think?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's a little different because it's his son. And listen, I don't have any problem with it. Of course, he shouldn't have said he wasn't going to do it. I think this is the issue with politicians in general and the American people believing them. But I think that if it was my son, 100%. And it's not like if this was a different charge, if these are charges of murder or something like that, it's a little bit different than what it was. But I do think what it did is just open up exactly what Trump has been saying and President-elect Trump's team has been saying, is that everything has been politicized so much in regards to our courts. And that's what concerns me the most. There's two things that concern me. One, that the American people continue to lose faith in our judicial system in general, which both this does as well as Trump. But second, what I really, really hope is House Republicans do not, or even Senate Republicans, do not drag Hunter Biden up, because even though he's pardoned, he still can go in front of Congress now and from the committees. And I just think, let sleeping dogs lie. Let's just move on. And, I don't know. We'll see if that happens. But, there's a lot of things to handle. So and deal with.
Sure are.
Let's
including potentially pardoning the January 6th, as Donald Trump refers to them, hostages. Does this guarantee that happens, or was that already happening?
I think it was already happening. Again, looking at the picks that he has in different justice positions, the exodus that it's been reported at the Department of Justice with career attorneys looking for other employment, that was likely going to happen regardless of this Hunter pardon.
I don't think he does a blanket pardon, though, for all of them.
Yeah.
I think he
not the most violent ones that are on camera attacking Yeah,
I think,
agree. Yeah.
That's just my opinion. I have no idea, but I think that there's different levels of people that were.
This is something we could be learning pretty soon, actually. Is Joe Biden done with pardons, or we get the raft that we usually get on the way out?
I think generally the raft, you're seeing him being attacked by the left, that he has actually not used the pardon power as much as even his predecessor, Donald Trump. So I think we'll see some more.
Next month's going to be interesting. Ashley Davis, Kevin Walling, thank you so much for a great conversation on Balance of Power. Check out the Washington Edition newsletter to follow up on all the stories we've been talking about. Find it on the terminal and online. And we'll meet you back here tomorrow on Balance of Power on Bloomberg TV and radio.